The year was 1887, and the land west of the Verde River held its breath. It was a place of stark truths, where the sun baked promises to dust and the wind stripped away everything but the essential bone of things. Isaac Weston knew this language of subtraction. It was the only tongue he had spoken for 5 years, ever since the silence had first fallen over his small clapboard house, a silence so profound it had its own weight. His life had been pared down to a ritual of survival. He rose before the dawn, the chill of the high desert air, a familiar ghost on his skin. He moved through the chores with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice and a deep, abiding weariness. His cattle, a small, hardy herd, were scattered across the sparse grassland, their calls a lonely counterpoint to the keening of the wind. He mended fences that seemed to lean away from civilization, their wires taut and humming with a tension that mirrored his own. His world was the circumference of his own labor, a circle he walked day after day, his gaze fixed on the ground before him. The house itself was a shrine to a life that was no longer his. Inside, Martha's presence lingered in the faint scent of lavender that clung to the curtains she had sewn, in the rocking chair by the cold hearth that he never sat in. The small room that was meant for a nursery held a cot he had built with his own hands, its wood smooth and pale, forever empty. The grief was not a sharp, piercing thing anymore. It had become a part of the landscape, like the jagged mesas on the horizon always present, immutable, a feature of his existence he had long ago stopped trying to conquer and had simply learned to live beside. He was a man hollowed out by loss, leaving a capable shell that went through the motions of living. One afternoon, as the sky bruised into the colors of a coming storm, a different kind of silence descended. It was heavier, more unnerving than the usual quiet. The cattle were still, their heads turned toward the east, the wind died down, and the world seemed to be waiting. Isaac felt it in his bones, a prickling unease that had nothing to do with the weather. He finished securing a loose gate and turned his steps toward the barn, the largest structure on his property, a cavern of wood and hay that smelled of earth and time. He pulled open the heavy door, its groan a familiar complaint. A sliver of bruised twilight cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air, and then he saw it. The sight was so wrong, so utterly alien to the monotonous rhythm of his life, that for a long moment his mind refused to process it. Hanging from one of the central rafters was a figure, a woman. Her body was limp, suspended by a thick rope coiled cruelly around her neck. Her dark hair, long and matted with dirt and blood, obscured her face. Her deerskin dress was torn, her limbs were slack, and from the rope, pinned to her chest by a splinter of wood, hung a crudely lettered sign. The words, scrawled in charcoal, were a brand of pure hatred. White man's woman. Isaac froze, his hand still on the barn door. The air thickened, charged with the violence that had been committed there. A cold fury, an emotion he had not felt in years, rose from the pit of his stomach. It was a desecration. Not just of a human life, but of his solitude, of the fragile peace he had built from the ruins of his world. He wanted to shut the door, to unsee it, to pretend the world outside his fence line had not finally breached his defenses with such brutal force. But he could not. He saw the slight, almost imperceptible twitch of a hand. She was alive. The realization struck him like a physical blow, shattering his paralysis. The storm of his reluctance warred with a deeper, older instinct, the simple, undeniable imperative to act. He let go of the door and strode forward, his boots heavy on the packed earth floor. He grabbed a hay knife from the wall, its blade honed and ready. Reaching up, he sawed at the thick rope with frantic, desperate strokes. The fibers gave way with a sickening rasp, and the woman's body fell into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. He stumbled back, steadying himself, and carefully lowered her to a pile of clean hay in an empty stall. For the first time, he saw her face clearly. She was native, her features fine-boned and smeared with grime and tears. A dark bruise was blooming across one cheekbone, her lip was split, and the flesh around her neck was a raw, brutalized purple. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, a tiny, fluttering sound in the immense stillness of the barn. He ripped the sign from her dress and crushed it in his fist, the splinter digging into his palm. He did not feel the pain. All he felt was the thrum of a world thrown violently off its axis, and the fragile, terrifying weight of the life he now held in his hands. He carried her out of the barn and into the house. Crossing the threshold with her in his arms felt like a profound transgression. This space, consecrated to memory and solitude, was now host to a stranger's pain. He laid her gently on his own bed, the one he had not shared since Martha's last breath. The sheets felt impossibly white and clean against her torn and dirty dress. For a moment he stood there, a stranger in his own home, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what had happened. The quiet life was over. The silence had been broken, not by joy or companionship, but by a savage act that had washed up on his shores like wreckage from a distant, violent sea. He worked with a grim, focused determination. He fetched water from the basin, his hands, calloused and rough from years of ranch work, moving with an unpracticed gentleness. He cleaned the grime from her face and arms, his touch hesitant. He found a small tin of salve Martha had used for burns and chapped skin and applied it carefully to the cut on her lip. The rope burn on her neck was the worst. It was a deep, angry ligature that made his throat clench in sympathetic pain. He did what he could, cleaning it as gently as possible and wrapping it with a strip of clean linen torn from an old shirt. She remained unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. He pulled a heavy quilt over her, her small form barely making an impression on the mattress. As he worked, he did not allow himself to think. He focused only on the task at hand, the water, the cloth, the salve. To think was to confront the questions that clamored at the edges of his mind. Who was she? Who had done this to her? And what in God's name was he going to do now? They were questions that led to a world of trouble he had spent 5 years avoiding, a world of men and their casual cruelty, of prejudice that festered like a sore. When he was done, he pulled the rocking chair from its corner and placed it by the bedside. He sat, his rifle laid across his lap, and began to watch. The storm finally broke outside, rain lashing against the window panes, the wind howling like a thing grieving. But inside the small house, a new kind of storm had begun, a tempest of fear, responsibility, and the terrifying, unwelcome flicker of a life entrusted to his care. The long night stretched before him, filled with the sound of the rain and the woman's faint, struggling breaths. She woke near dawn. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and cold. Isaac had not slept. He had watched the slow rise and fall of the quilt, a metronome marking the passage of a night that felt a year long. He saw her eyelids flutter, then open. Her eyes were dark, deep pools of terror. They fixed on him, a white man sitting by her bed with a rifle, and a small animal whimper escaped her lips. She flinched, trying to pull away, her body tensing as if expecting a blow. "Easy," Isaac said, his voice a low rasp, unused to speaking to another person. The words sounded foreign in the quiet room. "You're safe here." The words meant nothing to her. Safety was a concept that had been violently stripped from her world. He saw the terror in her eyes shift into a defiant, feral watchfulness. She was a cornered animal, wounded but not broken. He understood. He slowly stood up, making sure his movements were deliberate and non-threatening. He placed the rifle against the wall, an offering of peace, and backed away toward the main room. "I'll leave some water," he said, more to himself than to her. He ladled some from the bucket into a tin cup and placed it on a small crate just inside the bedroom door, a neutral territory between them. Then he retreated to the main room, leaving the door ajar. He could feel her gaze on him, a physical weight on his back. The days that followed fell into a new, tense rhythm. He went about his chores, but his awareness was tethered to the house. Every sound from within, a cough, the creak of the floorboards, pulled him taut. He was an unwilling jailer, and she was his terrified prisoner. He would prepare simple meals, broth and soft bread, and leave the plate on the crate by her door. For 2 days, the food remained untouched. The water in the cup would be gone, but she refused his sustenance. He never tried to force her. He simply replaced the cold food with fresh, a silent, repeated offering. He spoke little, and only when necessary. "The food's there," he would say to the closed space of the room, his voice flat. He did not ask her name, nor did he offer his again. Words felt like an intrusion, a clumsy tool for a situation that was beyond them. Their communication was in the language of thresholds and distances. He left the offering. She decided whether to accept. He kept his distance. She remained in her sanctuary of fear. On the 3rd day, he came in from the fields, weary and covered in dust, and saw that the plate was empty. A small, strange feeling coiled in his chest. It was not relief, not exactly. It was a knot of something less simple, a recognition of a small victory, a single step taken in a vast, uncertain wilderness. He took the empty plate and washed it, the simple domestic act feeling profoundly significant. He began to see her in fleeting glimpses. Sometimes he would catch a shadow of movement as he passed the open doorway. Once, looking back from the corral, he saw her silhouette in the window, watching him as he worked with the horses. The moment their eyes met, she vanished back into the shadows of the room. But it was a start. She was observing him, measuring him, trying to reconcile the man who had cut her down from the rafter with the men who had put her there. Sections. He found her dress, the one he had cut from her body, folded neatly on the floor outside her room. It was beyond repair, torn and stained. He understood the silent request. He went to a trunk at the foot of his bed, a trunk filled with Martha's things that he had not opened in 5 years. The scent of dried lavender and memory rose up, a painful, sweet perfume. He pushed past the ache in his throat and pulled out a simple calico work dress. It was plain and sturdy, a dress for a life of work, not of leisure. He folded it and placed it where hers had been. The next morning, it was gone. Later that day, he saw her for the first time outside the bed, wearing Martha's dress. It hung loosely on her thin frame, but it was whole. It was a shield. One evening, he was cleaning his rifle by the light of the lamp, the familiar ritual, a comfort in the unsettling new quiet of the house. He heard a floorboard creak behind him and turned. She was standing in the doorway of the bedroom, a spectre in his late wife's dress. Her face was still bruised, but the swelling had gone down. Her dark eyes were fixed on him, no longer with sheer terror, but with a deep, questioning caution. They stood in silence for a long moment, 2 survivors from different shipwrecks, washed ashore on the same deserted island. "My name," she said, her voice soft, like rustling leaves but clear, "is Winona." Isaac stopped his work, setting the cleaning rod down carefully. He looked at her, truly looked at the woman standing there, not just the problem he had to solve. He saw the immense strength it must have taken for her to speak, to offer a piece of herself. "Isaac," he replied, his own name feeling strange on his tongue. It was not a conversation, it was an exchange of flags, a fragile truce declared in the no-man's land between them. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and then retreated back into the bedroom. But the house felt different afterward. It was no longer a space occupied by him and a fearful presence. It was a space occupied by Isaac and Winona. The silence that resettled was not empty. It was filled with the weight of 2 names, spoken aloud. The truce held, fragile as a spider's web in the morning dew. Winona began to venture from the bedroom, her movements still as quiet and cautious as a doe at a salt lick. She would sit in the rocking chair by the hearth, the one Isaac never touched, and watch the low fire he built against the evening chill. She did not speak, but her presence began to weave itself into the fabric of the house. Isaac found himself adjusting to it, leaving the fire to burn a little longer, ensuring the wood box was full. They were small, unconscious gestures of accommodation. He learned her story not in words, but in the geography of her scars and the ghosts in her eyes. He saw the way she flinched at the sound of men's voices, even his own if he spoke too suddenly. He saw the way her hands, which he noticed were skilled and nimble, would tremble when she thought he was not looking. She had started to take on small tasks. One morning he came in to find the dishes from their separate, silent meals washed and stacked. Another day, she had taken one of his torn shirts and mended it with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. Each act was a quiet declaration, "I am not a burden, I am useful." He, in turn, began to open his world to her, in his own taciturn way. He started leaving the door ajar when he went out, a silent invitation for her to step into the sun. The first time she did, he watched from the far end of the pasture. She stood on the porch for a long time, her face turned up to the sky, as if reacquainting herself with the open air. She looked small and fragile against the vast, unforgiving landscape. A fierce, protective instinct, something he thought had died with his son, stirred within him. It was an unwelcome, complicated feeling, and he pushed it down, turning back to his work with a renewed vigor. Their conversations, when they happened, were sparse and practical. "The well is low," he would state, looking out the window. "It will rain soon," she would reply, her gaze also on the horizon, reading the sky in a way he could not, and she was always right. One afternoon, she was on the porch, weaving a small basket from dried grasses she had gathered near the creek bed. Her fingers moved with a practiced, fluid grace. Isaac stopped his work of repairing a bridle and watched her for a moment. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his curiosity overriding his usual reticence. She did not look up from her work. "From my mother, from my grandmother. It is the way." Her voice was soft, matter of fact. She offered no more, and he did not press. But it was another piece of her, another thread in the tapestry he was slowly, unconsciously piecing together. He was beginning to see the woman who existed beneath the trauma, a person of quiet dignity and deep-rooted knowledge. The change in him was subtle but profound. The sharp edges of his grief began to soften, not disappearing, but losing their power to cut. The silence in the house was no longer a monument to loss. It was a space they shared, punctuated by the small sounds of two people coexisting. He found himself looking for her when he came back to the house, his eyes scanning the porch or the window. The sight of her, a steady, quiet presence, began to feel less like an intrusion and more like an anchor. The house was starting to feel less like a tomb and more like a home. He was slowly, reluctantly, coming back to life. This fragile piece, however, was built on borrowed time. He was running low on flour, salt and coffee, staples he could not produce himself. A trip to Prescott was unavoidable. The thought of it filled him with a cold dread. Leaving her alone was one part of it. The other was facing the town, facing the world that had created the sign he had burned. He told her that morning, his words blunt, "I have to go to town for supplies." Winona stopped kneading the small loaf of bread she was making, her hands stilling in the dough. She looked at him, and for the first time he saw not just fear in her eyes, but a shared anxiety. She knew what the town represented. She gave a single sharp nod. "Be careful," she said, the two words carrying the weight of all her unspoken fears. "I will," he promised, the words feeling like a vow. "Bolt the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone." The ride to Prescott was tense. The familiar landscape seemed menacing, every shadow holding a potential threat. The town, when he reached it, was a jolt to his senses. The noise, the people, the smell-sit, all felt alien after his long isolation. He tied his horse in front of the general store and went in, his list clutched in his hand. Inside, the air was thick with gossip and the scent of pickles and dry goods. He gathered his things, keeping his head down, eager to be done and gone. But he could not avoid the conversations buzzing around him. "Found that tracker, Donovan, out by the creek," a man was saying to Mr. Hale, the store owner. "Beaten half to death. Said some renegade Lakota jumped him, looking for a woman he was. Isaac's blood ran cold. He kept his face impassive, focusing on a sack of beans as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. "What woman?" Hale asked, leaning over the counter. "The one that was with him." The man lowered his voice conspiratorially. "One of Callahan's boys was telling it at the saloon, said Donovan had bought her, but she put up a fight and ran off. Callahan and his sons went looking for her themselves. Swore they'd teach her a lesson she wouldn't forget." Callahan. The name was poison in the air. Patrick Callahan was a rancher from the north, a man known for his cruelty, and his two brutish sons who were chips off the old rotten block. They were men who saw the world as theirs for the taking, who believed their will was law. Isaac felt the crushed sign in his mind's eye, the hate-filled letters. It was them. He knew it with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut. He paid for his supplies, his movements stiff. He loaded the bags onto his packhorse, his mind racing. They had not found her, not yet, but they were looking. And a man like Callahan would not give up. He was a man whose pride was as vast and ugly as his cruelty. The sign was not just a statement of hate, it was a declaration of ownership. They would come for their property. As he was about to mount his horse, he saw them. Callahan and his two sons, Bill and George, swaggering out of the saloon across the street. They were big men, made bigger by their arrogance. Callahan's face was florid with drink, his eyes small and mean. They laughed, a loud, braying sound that set Isaac's teeth on edge. They were celebrating their power, their perceived right to brutalize and discard a human being. Isaac pulled the brim of his hat low and swung into the saddle, turning his horse away from them and heading out of town. He did not ride fast, not wanting to draw attention. But inside, his heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The threat was no longer a nameless shadow. It had a face, it had a name, and it was hunting for the woman he had left alone in his house. The fragile peace was shattered. The world was coming for them. The ride back to the ranch was a race against a coming darkness that had nothing to do with the setting sun. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the shape of a rider. Isaac's hand rarely strayed from the stock of his rifle. He was no longer just a man bringing home supplies. He was a guardian returning to his post, a post he now realized he had never truly left. He saw the thin curl of smoke from his chimney from a mile out, a beacon in the twilight. A profound sense of relief washed over him, so potent it almost buckled his knees. She was safe, for now. When he rode into the yard, the door remained bolted, as he had instructed. He dismounted and knocked, a specific rhythm they had not discussed, but that he hoped she would recognize as his. "It's May, Isaac." He heard the sound of the heavy bar being lifted from inside, and the door creaked open. Winona stood there, her face pale in the fading light, her eyes wide with a question she did not need to ask. She saw the answer in his face, in the grim set of his jaw. He carried the supplies inside, the familiar weight of the flour and coffee sacks a flimsy anchor in a sea of dread. He did not speak until everything was put away, until the door was bolted again, shutting out the vast, dangerous night. He turned to her in the lamplight. "The men who did this to you," he began, his voice low and even, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. "They're looking for you. A man named Callahan and his sons." He watched her face as he spoke the name. A flicker of recognition, of pure terror, crossed her features before she mastered it, her expression becoming a stoic, unreadable mask. But he had seen it. He knew. "They were in town," he continued. "They think you ran. They won't stop looking." Winona stood perfectly still, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. She stared at the floor for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. When she looked up, her eyes were not filled with the fear he expected. They were filled with a hard, cold fire. "This is your home, Isaac," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "You should not have this trouble." "It's my trouble now," he said, the words coming out before he had a chance to think about them, and he knew, in that moment, that they were true. Her fight had become his. His sanctuary was now their fortress. The choice had been made the moment he cut that rope. Everything since had just been the slow turning of a lock. "They will come here," she stated. It was not a question. "Yes," he said, "they will." A new understanding passed between them, an alliance forged in the face of a common enemy. The guarded distance they had maintained collapsed under the weight of this shared threat. They were no longer just two strangers under one roof. They were partners in a desperate gamble. The next 2 days were spent in preparation. The work was grim and purposeful. Isaac checked his rifle and his pistol, cleaning and oiling them, until the mechanisms moved with deadly smoothness. He counted his ammunition, laying the brass cartridges out in neat, gleaming rows. Winona worked alongside him, her movements efficient and sure. She sharpened every knife in the house, including the old hay knife he had used to cut her down, until their edges were razor-thin. She gathered stones from the creek bed, stones that fit a palm and could be thrown with lethal accuracy. They spoke little, their actions communicating everything. He showed her how to load and fire the pistol. Her hands were steady, her eyes clear, as she sighted down the barrel. She showed him how to rig a simple tripwire using a piece of twine and a stack of old tin cans, placing it across the main path to the house. It was a partnership of two very different worlds, a fusion of frontier grit and ancient survival skills. Sections, the land itself became their ally. Isaac knew every dip and rise, every patch of scrub that could offer cover. Winona knew the subtler language of the earth. She pointed out a ravine that offered a hidden line of retreat, a thicket of mesquite that was nearly impenetrable. Their fortress was not just the 4 walls of the house, but the entire 160 acres of Isaac's claim. On the 3rd evening, the warning came. The tin cans rattled in the distance, a crude but effective alarm. A dog they did not own began to bark frantically somewhere down the trail. Isaac and Winona exchanged a look across the main room. The time for preparation was over. "Get in the bedroom," Isaac commanded, grabbing his rifle. "Bar the door, don't come out." "No," she said, her voice firm. She held the heavy pistol in her hands. "My fight, too." He looked at her, the borrowed dress, the fierce determination in her eyes, the weapon held with a resolve that matched his own. He saw not a victim but a warrior. He gave a sharp nod. "Stay away from the window." He extinguished the lamp, plunging the house into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the windows. He moved to his position by the front window, peering out into the yard. 3 riders were approaching, their forms dark against the silvered landscape, Callahan and his sons. They rode with an arrogant confidence, as if they were simply coming to collect a piece of lost luggage. "Ho, the house!" Callahan's voice boomed, a thick, ugly sound that violated the night's peace. "We know you're in there, Weston, and we know who you've got with you. Send out our property, and we'll leave you be." Isaac rested the barrel of his rifle on the windowsill. His heart was a steady, cold drum in his chest. The fear was there, a knot of ice in his gut, but something else was stronger, a cold, righteous anger. This was his home, that was his partner, and these men would not have her. "She's not your property," Isaac called back, his voice cutting through the night, clear and unwavering. "And you're not welcome on my land. Turn around and ride out." A harsh laugh answered him. "Brave words, farmer, for a man hiding behind a woman's skirts. Last chance, send her out." Isaac sighted down the barrel of his rifle. He did not aim at Callahan, but at the ground just in front of his horse's hooves. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a deafening crack that shattered the night. Dirt exploded where the bullet hit, and Callahan's horse reared, screaming in panic. "That's your only warning," Isaac yelled. The answer was a muzzle flash from the darkness, and the whine of a bullet splintering the window frame next to his head. The battle had begun. The next minutes were a blur of sound and fury. Muzzle flashes lit the yard in brief, stark tableaus of violence. the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the percussive roar of gunfire. Isaac fired methodically, using the cover of the house, making every shot count. He heard the pistol bark from the other side of the room, and knew Winona was firing too, her shots adding to their defense. One of Callahan's sons, George, made a foolish rush for the house. Isaac tracked him, fired, and the man cried out, stumbling back into the shadows, clutching his leg. They were not expecting this level of resistance. They had expected a scared farmer, not a determined defense. "Circle around. Get the back," Callahan bellowed in a rage. Isaac saw Bill Callahan break away, running low toward the rear of the house. "The back window," he yelled to Winona. He heard her move, a shadow within the shadows. He kept his own fire focused on the father, forcing him to stay behind the cover of the water trough. A crash of glass came from the back of the house, followed by a single sharp report from the pistol. Then, silence from that direction. A terrible fear seized Isaac. He risked a glance away from the front and saw Winona standing by the back wall, the pistol smoking in her hand. She gave him a grim nod. One threat was down. The fury of Callahan's attack intensified. He fired wildly at the house, bullets thudding into the thick wooden walls. He was a man possessed, his arrogance curdled into pure, murderous rage. But he was alone now, and his position was exposed. Isaac saw his chance. In a lull, as Callahan was reloading, he moved. He slipped out the back door, the one Winona now guarded, and circled around the side of the house, using the deep shadows as cover. He moved with a hunter's silence, his boots making no sound on the soft earth. He came up on the far side of the corral, the water trough between him and his target. Callahan was still focused on the front of the house, screaming curses into the night. Isaac raised his rifle, the metal cold against his cheek. He had the man dead in his sights. He could end it, right there. End the hate, the cruelty, the threat. His finger tightened on the trigger. But he hesitated. He thought of Martha, of the peaceful life he had once craved. Killing a man in cold blood, even a man like Callahan, was a line he had never crossed. As he paused, a movement from the house caught his eye. Winona had thrown a burning log from the hearth out a side window. It landed in a pile of dry brush near Callahan's horse. The brush went up with a whoosh, flames leaping into the night sky. The horse, already spooked, screamed and bolted, galloping off into the darkness. Callahan was left stranded, exposed in the flickering firelight, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He turned, finally realizing the attack was coming from a new direction, and saw Isaac. He raised his pistol, a wild look in his eyes. Isaac didn't have a choice. He fired. The shot was true. Callahan staggered, dropping his pistol, a look of shocked surprise on his face. He clutched his shoulder, then sank to his knees, defeated. The fight was over. The silence that fell was more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence born of survival, heavy with the echoes of violence. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows across the yard. Isaac walked slowly forward, his rifle ready, until he stood over the wounded men. George was groaning, his leg wound painful but not fatal. Bill lay still by the back window. Callahan was on the ground, glaring up at him with pure, impotent hatred. The front door opened, and Winona stepped out onto the porch. The pistol was still in her hand. She looked at the scene, at the defeated men, and the man who had fought for her. Her face was calm, her gaze steady. Their eyes met across the yard, and in that look a whole volume was spoken. It spoke of shared battle, of loyalty proven, of a bond forged in fire and blood. He did not kill them. He bound Callahan's hands and tended to his and his son's wounds enough to ensure they would not bleed out before the sun rose. When dawn came, he loaded them onto their own horses and sent them on their way with a clear and final warning. "If you ever come back here," Isaac said, his voice low and deadly, "I won't patch you up next time." He watched them ride away, 3 broken figures against the rising sun, until they were nothing more than specks on the horizon. He turned back to the house. It was scarred, the windows shattered, the walls pocked with bullet holes, but it was still standing, and it was theirs. Winona was on the porch, sweeping away the broken glass. He walked up the steps, the weariness of the night settling deep into his bones. He stopped before her, and for the first time he reached out and gently touched the faint, fading line of the rope burn on her neck. It was a scar, but it was a scar that was healing. "It's over," he said softly. "Yes," she replied, her hand coming up to cover his. "It is over." In the days that followed, a new kind of life began. They worked together to repair the house, replacing the broken panes of glass, patching the bullet holes in the walls. The shared labor was a balm, a way of physically mending the violation that had occurred. The work was hard, but it was done together. The silence between them was different now, comfortable and easy, filled with an unspoken understanding. The ghosts in the house began to recede. The memory of Martha and his son was still there, a soft, poignant ache, but it was no longer the sole occupant of his heart. There was room now for something new. He would watch Winona as she worked in the small garden she had started, her hands gentle in the earth, and a feeling of profound contentment would settle over him. She brought life back not only to the soil, but to the barren landscape of his own soul. One evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. It was a ritual they had fallen into, a quiet moment to mark the end of the day. "This place," Winona said, her gaze on the horizon, "it was a place of great sorrow for you." Isaac was silent for a moment, surprised by her directness. "Yes," he admitted, "it was." "It is not anymore," she said, turning to look at him. "Sorrow can be a deep root, but it does not have to be the only thing that grows." He looked at her, at the resilience in her face, the wisdom in her eyes. She had faced the worst of humanity and had not only survived, but had found the strength to heal and to help him heal too. The hate-filled sign had called her a white man's woman, a label meant to shame and diminish her. But here, in this quiet corner of the world, they had dismantled that hatred and built something new in its place. They were not defined by the world's prejudices, but by the decency and respect they had shown each other. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, a natural, easy fit. It was not a grand, passionate declaration, but a quiet affirmation of all they had become to one another. They were two broken people who, by an act of unexpected kindness, had found a way to become whole again, together. The lonely cowboy had found more than just a woman in his barn. He had found a reason to live again, and in his quiet, steadfast protection, she had found more than just a refuge. She had found a home. The sun sank below the horizon, and in the gathering twilight they sat together, two solitary figures no longer alone, their shared silence a promise of all the sunrises yet to come.